Okay, we are back for the next part, and as you can see here, I have opened up the new project where I have the character that can move around, and there's nothing fancy about this. This is simply just a 2D sprite that is animated that I can move around with in a game world. And if we look at what we have in the scene, we have our camera, we have the player, we have the background, then have a game object, which is basically a collider that makes sure that I can't run out of the map. And then I have an event system. Basically, I can delete this event system because it's going to be created from what we're going to do right now. In here in my asset folder, I have the animations for the player. This is not interesting. I have a prefab folder, which we will also create later. I have the scene. Then I have the scripts that we just created, combat text manager, and our player. My player looks a little different because I am animating him, so don't be confused about this. This is not important for the tutorial at all. It's simply just making him animated when he runs around. Then we have some sprites, and I would recommend that you take some sprites, like 2 different sprites or something, or 3 maybe, and you import them to your project. So that I have my bonfire and my heart, you can import some other ones. One thing I didn't mention before you can actually take a sprite and drag it into the scene like this, you need to make sure that you have selected it and set the texture type to 2D and UI. If you haven't done that, if it's on texture as it is a standard, well then you are not able to drag it into the scene, as you can see here, as I'm doing right now. So always select Sprite 2D and UI and click apply. Yeah, and then I have Unity Visual Studio, which is not imported either. This is just the player sprite sheet I have here and the world I'm running around in. So basically you will only need to add 2 different sprites, just drag them off scene and drag them into your project here, and just set the sprite, the texture to Sprite 2D and UI. Okay, so now that we have a character we can move around with in our game world, we should be able to add some text, or we should add some text. So you can click on the create up here in the hierarchy, click UI, and then you can select the text. So notice that when you selected that text, it added a canvas to the scene and it added an event system. So basically the event system is used for interaction, keyboard input and so on, to the UI system here. So that, for example, if you have more buttons, you can click on your arrows to navigate between those buttons and so on. So it has some navigation events and stuff like that. So it's not important for this tutorial at all. I'll just take note of that this is actually instantiated when we create a text. As you can see, the text also has a canvas as a parent. And the canvas is always needed in a game when we need to render some UI elements. It goes for buttons, everything under this UI goes for panels, buttons, text, images, and so on. If these are not a child object of a canvas, well then you won't be able to see them in your game. For example, if we have the text here, see if we can find it, it's over here. And yeah, you can see I'm moving it into the screen down here. I can see the text. If I would take this text and move it outside the canvas, well then it disappears, as you can see here, because it's not a child object of the canvas anymore and it's not rendered to the screen. So to make sure that we can always see our text, we'll have to take text again and put it back into the canvas. And that's simply the main function of this canvas. It makes sure that we can actually render our UI elements. There's also other things in the canvas. We can make sure that we can put stuff in layers, and we can scale stuff and sort them and everything. First of all, I would like to set the rendering mode of our canvas. Right now it has set to the UI scale mode here is set to constant pixel size. And as you can see right now, the text, it takes up quite a bit of space. It's actually it's larger than our player basically. And if I would maximize this game and play it again, you'll see that the text becomes very small, and now it's suddenly smaller than the player because it has a constant pixel size. And we're not interested in that. We want the text to scale with the screen size, so whenever you export it to a tablet, it might get bigger than if you export it to a small mobile phone device. So to make sure that it scales with the screen, just click on the canvas, select the UI scale mode here, and set it to scale with screen size. As you can see, it got larger right away, this text here. So if you run the game one more time, you'll see that the text has the same scale ratio, what should I say, compared to the screen size. So you can see here, it's kind of large compared to the player. It goes all the way out here. And if we play our game, we can see that it basically goes as far out here when I'm in full screen as when I'm in not full screen. That was one thing. So basically right now, our canvas rendering mode is set to screen space overlay. And this means that it takes up the space on the whole screen here. And no matter where I'm placing this, I should be able to see it, see the text somewhere on my screen. As you can see, this one takes up the whole screen size. It's a little hard because I made the background black here, but you should still be able to see that is at the edge here when it's at the edge. That's because it's screen space overlay. But in our case, we're not interested in doing screen space overlay because our text has to be instantiated at the player's specific position in our game world. And when we run off screen, the combat text should not follow the player, or we can change that later, but it should be instantiated. Let's say that I shoot an enemy, and the combat text needs to be instantiated on top of that enemy and scroll upwards. So to make sure that we can instantiate stuff different places in our game world without having it just being spawned on the screen no matter where we are, then we have to set screen space overlay here to screen space camera, for example. So when we set it to screen space camera, the text here is connected to a camera. So we can select the camera that should render this this text here. So we can just take our main camera and drag it onto this space here called render camera. So now whenever we will move our camera around in our game world, if I could do it, when we move our camera around in our game world, the text here you can see is following the camera. And that's exactly how we want it. We don't want it to be on top of the screen, we want it to be connected to the camera. If later we want the text to be instantiated somewhere in the game world, instead of being following the camera when the player moves, then we can take it and set this one to world space instead. So you can see when we move the camera, the text is not, oh sorry, that's the text I'm following. If we move the camera here, you can see the text is not following the camera anymore when it's set to screen space. But it'll be easier to see how this works later when we are actually instantiating our text on the go when we are creating our game. So for now, just put it back to screen space camera here and leave the main camera as the rendering camera. And I guess we can put the pixel perfect in here. Yes. So right now we would like to create our text, make it a little smaller maybe. We can do that in some different ways. First of all, we can select the text here, and we could scale it down like this, but this will make it not so pretty later when we scale it up or down, because it might get some rough edges on the text. So please keep the scale to 1. Select best fit for the text here, and then you can set the minimum size to 10 and the maximum size to 20, for example. Let's say, I don't know if that's too big, 12, 13, okay. I'm gonna go with 13 here to have the text kinda similar to the player size, I think. So you can also go to the canvas and you can change the width and height of the canvas. As you can see, when you change the canvas size, the match size of the canvas scaler, then the text size also changes. But you can keep it at 0 for now. So these are the different ways that you can use to change the scale of the text. So when you have set the text to what you want, you can see you can also change the font size. It doesn't have any effect when you have best fit here when you set a minimum and a maximum size. Basically set the minimum and the maximum size to the same if you want to. As well here you can select bold if you want the text to be bold, and so on if you want to customize it as you want to, bold and italic for example. I'm just going to keep it at normal. So now that we have our text set up with the correct size here, and you'll see when we play our game, it still fits with the player size pretty well, I think. When you've done that, we can create a prefab. So basically this text here, we'll need to create a prefab from that. So go to your prefab folder, and if you don't have a prefab folder, just click on Assets, right click, select Create, and select Folder. When you've done that, we can take the text and drag it into that folder to create a prefab. And here we have our text. So right now we will need to make it move first of all, so that when we add it to our game world, the text will start moving around. And the easiest way to do that is just to create a script that has an update function on it. And we already created this script before. We created this combat text script here. So go to your prefab, click on your text, click on Add Component, search for scrolling, what do we call combat text here, and add the combat text script to the text. So basically, to be able to instantiate this text, we will have to create our combat text manager, and I think we did that before in the other project, so I'm gonna do this quickly. Create empty if you haven't done it. Select the game object and call it combat text manager. And on that one we have to click Add Component and select the combat text manager. So now we have the combat text manager on our combat text manager game object, and this is the game object that the player can ask to put up some text on top of him if, for example, he takes damage or something. So if we go to our scripts and select our combat text manager here, open it up, have it here, yes. Then we have to write some code. You might have an update function and a start function. You can basically delete them because we're not going to use them for anything here. So just to get a cleaner script, you can delete them. First of all, we need to be able to access the combat text manager from everywhere in our game world, or in our game. So the player needs to be able to access this one without having to find the game object first. So we are going to create a singleton pattern in this combat text manager. So a singleton pattern, as I have explained in a lot of my other tutorials, is a way of accessing a class without having an instance of an object, and is a way of making sure that there is only one instance of this class in the game. This is a little different in Unity, but we will use the singleton in this case to be able to access this script right away from our player. So basically we are going to write private static combat text manager and call it instance. Okay, so this is the accessor. It's going to be private. We're creating a static instance here, and the reason that it's static is because we want to be able to access it on the class level, and I'll show you in a moment how this works. Then we need to create a property to access it, so we are going to write public static combat text manager, and we're going to call it instance with a large I. Under here we are going to write get and a scope, and in here we need to set that combat text manager if we haven't set it already. So if our instance, this instance up here, if it's null, which means we haven't accessed this before, so if it's null, then we're going to say, well, instance is equal to game object defined of type combat text manager, return combat text, let's just say instance, return instance. Okay, so this gives us access to everything inside this class here by going through the instance, because it returns itself basically. So in our game we have our combat text manager here with the script on it, and it's going to return itself. So if the player wants to access something inside the combat text manager, then we can go through this instance here. So for example, if we are going to request some scrolling combat text, well, then we can go through the instance to get that scrolling combat text. Yeah, so basically if it doesn't exist, if we haven't accessed it before, it's null, then we're going to set it, and then we're going to return it. Next time we access it, it's already set, So we're not going to call this code here, and we're going to return the instance. So how do we access this? When something is static, we go to our player, and we need to access this code here. Don't mind all this code here, you don't have that, but it's simply just because I need to move my player around and animate him. So don't get confused about all this code here. You only need to write the code I'm writing now, or this is just a demonstration. So to access the combat text manager, I need to write combat text dot instance. Sorry, not combat text. Combat text manager dot instance. As you can see here, that's the instance we created before, right here, called instance, and then dot, and then we can access everything on the combat text manager, as you can see here, without having to find the game object first. So that's the point in the singleton. The reason that it's static is because we want to access it on the class level. If something is static, let's say we would make a, this is just an example, public float health, for example, on the combat text manager. Well, if I should access this health here, I would have to say game object dot find let's see here, game object dot find text manager dot get component combat text manager dot health to access it, right? So now I'm accessing that specific health on the combat text manager. Don't mind the red line, is just an example. So that's how I'm accessing something when it's not static. If I would make this one static, public static float, I would be able to say combat text manager dot health, just like that, without finding the game object first, and without having to get the component of the combat text manager and so on. But you need to be aware, when something is static, then there's only one instance of that thing, which means if you had more combat text managers with a health variable on them, then all the combat text managers would share that variable. So if you change one combat text manager's health to 10, then all your other combat text managers will also have 10 in health. I know it doesn't make sense for a combat text manager to have health. It's just an example. So that's why we are making our instance here static, so that I can write combat text manager dot instance instead of saying game object dot find combat text manager and then get component combat text manager dot instance. So this is way easier. Okay, that was a little side note. So now we have the ability to access our combat text manager everywhere, so we can always access it whenever we need to instantiate some text. For example, if our enemy takes damage, then we can simply go to our enemy and say that we want to show some combat text because we just took some damage. Next thing we need to do is to create the function that will allow us to create our combat text in our game. So let's create a new function called public void create text. And this one should instantiate our text. So let's make a public game object called text prefab. And down here in instantiate create text, we are going to say instantiate text prefab dot, we need to find the position, and we need to find, so the position should be given from here, so we can make a position vector free position, and we need to take the position here, and criterion dot identity. Okay, so let me explain. When our player needs to instantiate this text here, he needs to instantiate it on his own position. So our player, let's say that we in our update here would say if input the get key get key down. This is just an example. You can also write this code. So in our players update, if our input.get key down, key code, dot space. So if we click the space button, we would like to instantiate some text, for example, to our in our game, some scrolling combat text. So we can say combat text manager dot instance dot create text, and now it's asking for a position to create our text, because we just created this parameter here, or argument here, that we need to take in a position whenever we create some text, and we are going to use that position to instantiate text prefab at the correct position, which is the player's position in this example. Later it might be an enemy's position, or some loot on the ground's position, or something like that. Quaternion.identity. This basically, if you want to rotate the object you just instantiated, you can get a quaternion here, but we're just going to say identity, so it's going to keep the same rotation as the prefab. So this one is basically just tells us ignore the rotation, we don't want to rotate our object. So in our players, if we get key down space, then we need to instantiate it, and we're going to instantiate it at GameObject.transform. Can we just say transform, actually transform.position. So we're going to instantiate this text exactly at the player's own position. So now we can create our text. Let's try to go to our, this one. So let's try, we have our canvas, we have our text. Right now we don't need the text here, we can delete this one from the canvas, and we could take the prefab here, text. Then we can go to our combat text manager, and as you can see, the combat text manager needs a text prefab on it so that it can instantiate the text somewhere in our game world. We can take the text here and drag to this empty slot. And we need to do something else. As I explained in the beginning, whenever we instantiate something in our game, something that is a UI element, you'll see that it's not going to be visible anywhere here in the game. And that's because it's not a child object of the canvas yet. So we also need to do from our code so that our text becomes a child object of our canvas, so that we can actually see it somewhere. And of course we need to scale it down and everything and place it at the correct position, as you can see here. So first of all, let's see if we can even instantiate it. So if we go to our code here and save it, make sure that you have made that create text and everything, and you have the code in your player where you press the space key. So if we go back to the game, play it, press space. Now I don't need to be in full screen because I can't see my hierarchy. I press the space button. You'll see that I get the text clone here, and it's just text somewhere in here in my game, and if I put it under the canvas here, I'll be able to see this large text here. So we need to, from our code, we need to put it as a child object of the canvas, and we need to scale it to the correct size. So let's try to do that before we end this part of the tutorial. This should be pretty simple to do. So if we go to the instantiate here, we can say we need a reference to the text we just created. So we can write GameObject scrolling combat text sct equals instantiate, and then we need to cast it to a GameObject, because this one apparently doesn't return a GameObject. So we're gonna cast it to a GameObject so that we can save it inside this GameObject called sct. Okay, first of all, we need to set it as the parent of the GameObject, and we can set the parent by getting the canvas, which should be the parent. So public GameObject, or actually it's the rect. See if I can find rect transform called canvas transform. So this is transform of our canvas. So we need to access that. From here we need to say that our scrolling combat text that set parent transform that set parent, I think it's called. There we go. Is equal to the canvas transform. So if we save this, jump into Unity, take our combat text manager, and you can see now there's canvas transform it needs, which is a rect transform. We can take our canvas and drag it here. There. And when we are dragged it there, well, then we can actually try to play our game again. And click the space button. And as you can see, our text is now a child object of our canvas, because we need to show it somehow. So now we have the text object in the correct position, or not position, in the correct hierarchy order under our canvas. One more thing I would like to do, you can see the text in the top left corner here. I would actually like to put it in the middle like this, just like this or something. Maybe on top, I don't know, we can adjust this later, but at least put it in the middle, so it aligned in the middle. So select your prefab and select the middle here, in the middle here. So now it's at least in the center of the box that it's instantiated in. Okay, that was one thing. Now we need to set the scale correct. So we can say sct.get component rect transform. And the reason that we are getting the rect transform here is because if I run my game and instantiate the text, then you'll see that this rect transform component over here has a scale of 81. And if I would make this 1 to 1, I guess, see if we can find it anywhere, then you'll see the text has the correct size suddenly if I set the scale to 1, 1, 1. And this is what we're going to do from the code. So that's why we're actually saying get component to get the correct component, and then we're saying rect transform to access the rect transform right here, and then we need to access the scale and set it to 1, 1, 1. So let's try that. Rect transform dot local scale, I guess, equals new vector 3, because this is a vector, the text here, x, y, and z. So we need to say new vector 3. And basically, I guess we can set it to 1, 1, 1. Let's see what happens. Okay, let's save this. And sorry about my phone. Let's try again. And now when we instantiate the text here, you'll see that it has the correct scale. It has 1 and 1 and 1. And it's just not placed right yet, but it has the size that we actually want it to have. Okay, so now we need to set the correct position actually. Right now we are instantiating at the player's position. So if I would go to my game and move over here and instantiate, it's going to be instantiated right on top of the player. But I would like to instantiate it up here or something in the top of the player. So basically what I can do is that I can go to, see if I can remember the text here, and let's try to find it. There's the text. As you can see on the text, you should be able to change the pivot point. Give me 1 sec. Okay, so I don't know why I'm not able to move the pivot point with the mouse here, but we can simply just do it ourselves with our numbers over here. Basically, what you need to do is to, this one was the original value, I just moved it around before. This is the original values of the pivot point. As you can see, it's like 0.5 and 0.5, which means that it's set in the center of the text. Basically what you need to do is to make sure that the pivot point, the Y pivot point, is down here, so that it will be instantiated on top of the player instead. And you can basically do that by selecting the Y pivot point here and then making it to 0, so that this one basically jumps down here. Apparently you can't see it anymore. Usually you could see that in earlier versions of Unity. I don't know why you can't see it right now. But it doesn't really matter. Just set the Y to 0 and then take the text and drag it onto your prefab. Or you can simply just take your prefab selected and change the Y value to 0 if you didn't have it in your scene. Let's delete this. Another thing, if you're working with a single sprite, this is if you're working with a single sprite. Let's say that I can find this one. Then you can see the single sprite has a pivot point here, and this pivot point can be set to something else. You can set it to the top. So if you set the sprite you're working with to pivot point to top, then its spawn point is also going to be in the top of it instead of center, so the text will also be aligned on top of the sprite instead of being on the middle of the sprite. So this is also a little thing you can do if you're working with a single sprite that is not animated. If you are working with an animated sprite on a sprite sheet, for example, this is just some extra notes. If you click on the sprite sheet here, we can go to the Sprite Editor, and in here you can also set the pivot point to something else. I could pick the top here if that's what I wanted, but basically it's up to you if you want to change that as well. You can play around with it. I'm just going to leave it at the center because I'm pretty sure this is going to work. But else, if it doesn't work, then you can simply also put this one to top and then apply if that's what you want. I'm just going to revert. I'm not going to do that. But picking up where I just left off when I got sidetracked, the text pivot point is set to 0 in Y. So if I play my game now and instantiate my text, you'll see that it is placed on top of the player now instead of being placed on the middle of the player, as you can see. So now we can create some text on top of the player. So I'm going to wrap this part up here, and in the next part we are going to have a look at how we can actually move the text around and how we can change the colors and everything of the text.